Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with Daniel Mendelsohn?
Hi, Paul. This is Daniel.
Daniel, what a pleasure to have you on this call. Thank you so much for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. I'm really delighted that you made the time for it. Tell me.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Tell me, what have you been up to for the past, let us say, 4 months?
4 months. Well, I have been in my home in the Hudson Valley. I started isolating fairly early on because a colleague of mine was sick very early in March. And so I started going into deep isolation, I think around March 5th. And I've been here ever since. I have really not strayed more than a couple of miles from my house. So what have I been doing? We were in the middle of the semester. I was teaching a course on classical epic at Bard, and we had to obviously do all kinds of acrobatics to finish the semester remotely. And then it's been, in a certain way, as you could imagine, I'm a writer, so I spend most of my time sitting at home anyway. So at the beginning, I don't feel it was that much of an adjustment. I must say, in the past couple of weeks, it's really begun to affect me more than it has in the past, because I think we are just, at a certain point, everyone talked about turning the corner, but it seems clear now there is no corner. We've just gone off a cliff.
There might be a corner, but what's behind it?
Yes, exactly. So reading and writing, watching a lot of television, going for long walks with my neighbors, and just trying to stay sane, basically.
Before we get to your attempts at staying sane and how successful you have or have not been at it, Daniel, talk to me a little bit about the what you called acrobatics in teaching, because you're a professor at Bard College, and I know you have views on our online world. And so the views on the online world combined with classical literature, combined with Daniel Mendelsohn, how does that all work out?
Well, I have to say, I personally found, what were the acrobatics? I mean, we here at Bard, I think nearly all the classes are very small seminar-style classes, and certainly all of the literature classes that I teach, are maybe a dozen or 16 students sitting around a seminar table talking about the text. Obviously, the necessity of going remote really, created a challenge to the sort of dynamics that one wants to have in a literary seminar. I have to say, so then everyone was scrambling and learning how to do Zoom. And honestly, it wasn't as bad as I thought. I was lucky. Obviously, this thing hit in the middle of the semester. We were a month and a half into the semester. I knew my students. I had 5 or 6 weeks of in-class experience with them. So by the time we went remote, we sort of knew each other. And so it wasn't that much different from having Zoom cocktails with one's old friends. I think there's a huge challenge facing schools that are going to be teaching remote as of this fall, because I think the dynamic is extremely different when you don't actually know the students, as I was lucky to know my students. Anyway, it was a little bit uncomfortable at first, but we all got used to it. I think the students were fabulous. They were very game. They threw themselves into this Zooming wholeheartedly. And overall, it was, I think, a success. I will say, Paul, that and this is something a lot of people I know who teach at the college level talk about, the energy that goes into teaching via Zoom seems to be about 3 times as much as when one is just in the classroom normally. I think you have to sort of it's a bit like being a silent movie star in a funny way. You just have to sort of put so much into the screen, in a way, of course, that you don't when you're sitting 3 feet away from people. So I did find, after this was a once a week, 2.5 hour seminar. So it's a long class. And, when I was finished at 4:00 every week, I would just sort of lie down in a stupor. It was exhausting. But, overall, I think it worked out well. I was lucky. I had a wonderful, wonderful class, wonderful group of students, and the material was great. But it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, obviously, in the new academic year.
Yeah, I'm very curious to think about the cognitive aspect of all of this, and we already run so much. I mean, to quote T.S. Eliot, we're distracted from distraction by distraction. We're already so embedded, as it were, with Apple products that I'm really concerned, and I know that you are concerned with how the pandemic and the economic crisis will affect the humanity departments and colleges. And what do you think? Because we're obviously we can only sort of imagine what might happen, but from where you sit.
I mean, I think one thing that has occurred to me and has been preying on my mind quite a bit. I mean, the humanities are always, particularly in this country, struggling to justify themselves as a serious endeavor in college and university teaching. And in the past years, with the tremendous rise of STEM, we've had to fight even harder to justify the importance of the humanities. Now, my great terror is that because of the economic crisis that has resulted from the epidemiological crisis, there will be an even greater push to have students go in the direction of STEM because it's perceived as being more practical. And I think that is going to further push the humanities to the edge. So this is something that I'm quite concerned about. And of course one could always say, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but obviously the humanities is the only thing that's going to help us make sense of a lot of what's going on. But that's a hard line to push to people who are trying to...
Yeah, it's a hard line to push, but I think it's one we'll try pushing during our conversation now. And so immediate, I'm not going to peddle the idea. I believe in it deeply, as you well know. But you've written this magnificent book that's forthcoming. I must say it moved me really very deeply on so many levels. So many of the subjects are really dear to my heart, and I feel you've woven. It's a wonderful three extraordinary figures coming together. It's called Three Rings: A Tale of Exile, Narrative, and Fate, and it's really an organized web of obsessions you've brought together. And I love the way it begins. A stranger arrives in an unknown city after a long voyage. Tell me why you chose to begin with that sentence, which certainly, knowing of your interests and your specialization, there are many echoes in that sentence.
Well, it's interesting, Paul. So as you say, the book weaves together the stories of 3 writers from wildly different periods.
Yes.
Who each of whom was in exile in a certain way. And in some sense, it's the story of these 3 writers and the way in which exile affected their own thinking about writing. But as you know, I published a couple of years ago a memoir which has the Odyssey at its center, Homer's Odyssey.
Yes.
And so actually, when I wrote that sentence, I was recurring again to the Odyssey and trying to assimilate these exiles to the figure of Odysseus, who you could say is the sort of core figure in the Western tradition of the hopeless wanderer. And as you know from reading the book, the Odyssey and Odysseus sort of recur as a leitmotif in this new book as well. All of these writers were somehow interested in the Odyssey, as I am. But I was just haunted. And as you also know, I've written a big book about the Holocaust and the way it intersects with my family history. And so I've always very much on my mind this a sort of a picture. It's almost it's an image of a refugee standing in front of some, who's made it out and has landed in some new country. They don't speak the language. They're looking at some building where they're going to live. They don't know what's going to happen to them. And that sentence that you just quoted, actually, as you know, recurs very often in the book. It introduces each section of the book.
I loved that. I loved it. The leitmotif. I mean, I loved it in its repetition.
Yes, thank you. So I keep recurring to this both in the book and, as you say, it is a book of obsessions. I sort of weave together all of my own intellectual obsessions, the storytelling, refugees, political oppression, religious persecution, the Odyssey, and they're all in this book swirling around. But the central figure of the book is this sort of blank figure, wearily confronting an unknowable future, I would say. And I couldn't get that out of my mind, and I just decided to start with that. And the reader doesn't know who it is either at the beginning of the book. And in fact, it turns out to be many people, starting with, I would say, Odysseus. Who is that person? A new place? Are they friends or enemies? How are you going to get by? And I sort of tie that with a lot of other things and other characters in this new book.
And couldn't it be more poignant to have that figure as a central figure, as it were, in this book at this moment?
Yes. Well, I think, look, we're all thinking, it's funny because, of course, I wrote the book last year,
yes, of course,
before the current crisis. But, I've always been interested in the way in which history operates on, so to speak, the little people, the ordinary people, as it did on my family, and the sort of large current of history with the capital H, and the way they inundate ordinary people just trying to get by. Look, this is why I'm interested in Cavafy, which, as you know, is another obsession of mine. The Greek poet Cavafy, who was also very interested in the way that history operated on ordinary people. And so somehow I think that preoccupation of mine just suddenly seems even, more to the point, more germane than ever before, because we're all being operated on now by large currents of history, whether we wanted to acknowledge them or not. They are now sweeping us away in precisely that way. And so I think, this is what we should all be thinking about. It's interesting in Cavafy, and I know you're a fellow Cavafian, and especially in your new role, are paying attention to things Greek.
Yes.
But, this idea of, and this is a very Greek idea, I think both ancient and modern, certainly it's an idea with Cavafy, that you can ignore history, but it will not ignore you. And that is a recurring theme of so many of his poems. And I think to some extent, what we are seeing unfolding in this extraordinary, concentrated and dramatic way in this country is a country, many of whose people thought that they were somehow immune from history and politics and epidemiological disasters. And you know what? You can't ignore it. Well, you can ignore it, but it has not been ignoring us, so to speak. So I don't know. Of course, when you're in a book, when you're thinking about a book, you tend to see your book in everything. But I'm not so sure I'm wrong on this one.
Obviously, as you said, you wrote this book a year ago. You had no knowledge of what was to come. And it brings to the foreground this notion that the classics, however much some people don't like the term, have a staying power. and they have a staying power. And for you, immersed as you are in the Odyssey, not only are you immersed in it, but you are re-immersed in it, as I understand now, because you're translating it.
Yeah, I have.
Why? Why do we need another translation, Daniel?
Because they asked me.
Okay, but you could
I'm easy,
you could say no.
I'm easy.
A likely story.
They asked me a couple of years ago, and I was just coming out of my Odyssey memoir. I think this is about the beginning of 2018, maybe. And look, everyone who's intimate with a certain literature has ideas about the way it ought to be translated. And you have, particularly with an author you spend a lot of time with, in my case, Homer. Although I could say the same exact thing happened when they asked me to translate Cavafy. You have a sound of an author in your mind, and that's what you're trying to bring over. So, and I think it's very important to emphasize that to undertake a new translation of something, although, it is the case that they asked me before I had the idea, it's not to say you don't like the existing translations or you disagree with them or you hate them or you don't think they're good. It just means that a very specific idea that you have, the sound of this poet's voice that you have in your head, you're going to try to bring across in your way. So I thought, well, this is interesting. And in the case of Homer, I mean, my God, there are so many wonderful translations, but I have an idea that I'm trying to work out in this translation about the sound of Homer as I perceive it, the long Homeric line, which I'm trying to convey. So we'll see. It's the greatest intimacy you can have, apart from being in a relationship, I think, is translating a writer. There's nothing more intimate because you essentially have to be in that writer's head in a funny way. You have to make this incredible deep dive, and it is a kind of intimacy. So I'm enjoying it. I mean, we'll see what happens. But it seemed, in a funny way, looking back, one never plans these things, but it did seem the next natural step in a funny way after my Odyssey book.
And I love what you were saying about sound, because really the grain of the voice. I'm not a translator, but I'm always particularly taken by people's voice. And I've often said that I could never fall in love with someone whose voice I didn't love. It's so important. Now, I want to go to what I think is the core, but there might be many, since it's about rings and it's about digression and it's about meandering. But still, there's one figure in your new upcoming book that matters to me greatly, and I know you probably know who I'm going to talk about.
I know.
Is Erich Auerbach and mimesis. When I was studying comparative literature 100 years ago, that book truly transformed my life. And rereading yesterday the epilogue, just in preparation to speak to you, I want to ask you, why Auerbach, and how can Auerbach, in the strangest way, perhaps help us now?
Well, obviously, I think we're very much on the same wavelength. And when I sent you the book, I had a hunch that you were an Auerbachian. Erich Auerbach is a German scholar of literature, born at the end of the 19th century, who was a specialist in Dante, actually, and Romance languages and philology. And was hounded out of his academic position by the Nazis and fled in the mid-1930s to Istanbul, of all places, which at that time was very eager to have European scholars. There was a sort of a pro-Western moment in Turkish intellectual history. And so Auerbach fled for his life to Istanbul and was followed soon after by his wife and teenage son. And there wrote this very great study of Western literature called mimesis, which is the Greek word for imitation. And it's called mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature. And it's a series of 20 chapters, each one of which take a section of a work, starting with Homer and ending with Virginia Woolf and Proust. So it covers basically the whole gigantic arc of Western literature. and analyzes the passage and tries to evoke the way in which this work evokes reality. How does literature make reality feel real? There are many other issues involved, but this is, to my mind, one of the really greatest works of scholarship. And I almost hate to say scholarship because, as you know, it's incredibly readable. It's not academic in the way that we think of that word, if you know what I mean.
I do.
It's so ingenuous and charming in a way. But the poignant thing about Mimesis is that he wrote this great Valentine to the West and Western literature in the East. You know, he had to run away from the West, which was destroying itself, and the poignancy of that. And then there's also this story, which is a little bit of an exaggeration, that, you know, because he didn't have the kind of libraries that he was used to when he was working in Istanbul, he basically had to write this book from memory of many of these texts.
Why is it an exaggeration? I really would love to know, because reading it yesterday, I have to tell you again, I mean, it felt like seeing the first minutes of The Bicycle Thief. It just brings tears.
It is. Well, he did. I mean, there were actually some libraries that he was able to work with, but it is true that, and he himself wrote this in a postscript, that not having access to every scholarly journal and every recent, you know, article about everything he was writing about sort of liberated him to be more creative and free in his general overview of these works. There's a wonderful story about how actually he needed access to some text, that very specialized early Christian literature, and there was a library near Istanbul that was belonged to a Catholic monastery, and the Catholic prelate allowed this Jewish refugee scholar to use the library, and the prelate turned out to be the man who later became Pope John the 23rd, who seems to have been a mensch all along. Anyway, there's this sort of, to me, there's this great poignancy about this figure who has to run away from Europe to write this great book about the greatness of European civilization, which was destroying itself even as he wrote this book. And so I'm obsessed with him, and have been for a long time, because of this idea that he has in his mind a kind of model of what the West could be, although it was failing terribly to be that at the time. And he's in his mind, as I say in my book, in this book of his, creating a kind of a museum of the European culture that was destroying itself while he was sitting in Istanbul writing this book. So he is the refugee, the stranger standing in front of an unknown building in a new city. But he has with him his memory of the past, of the culture that he represents, and recreates it and gives it to us. And I think there's something unbelievably powerful about his story. I also encountered him in graduate school. In fact, that's where I first knew you.
Right.
And the book itself, I think, is a great achievement. But if you know the backstory, it takes on a kind of shadowed, touching quality, which is very hard to get out of one's mind. And I always knew I wanted to write about him. You know, in a way, to come back to my favorite work, he is an Odysseus figure. I mean,
That's
Odysseus, right, also wanders around with this idée fixe of this one thing that he's hanging on to, this one memory that he hangs on to that gives everything that he does purpose and meaning, which is home. And I think in a funny way, Auerbach in that sense is a sort of Odyssean figure, which of course I try to underscore that parallel in the new book.
And as I said, I think at this particular moment, what it might mean to hold literature in one's head, however many or few libraries one might have, is particularly, I mean, it's pungent with meaning. And you've said that what you admire about the Greeks is their willingness with which they stare pain, suffering, and death in the face.
Yeah.
And, you know, that together with what you just said about Auerbach, I'm wondering how that's playing itself off now when you see the world going through this major, really double pandemic, one for which we might find a cure and one which will take much longer.
Yeah. Well, I, as you say, I've always been, as an American studying the classics, I've always been attracted to the Greeks because they are very matter of fact about the omnipresence of pain in human life. And I think there are certainly aspects of American civilization that try to pretend that pain and death are not essential, are not omnipresent. You know, we want to be young and beautiful forever.
Yes.
And when death happens, we shoo it off into a corner and prefer not to think about it. And I think, look, one could say the whole point, as you know, my actual specialty when I was studying classics was Greek tragedy.
Yes.
And you could say the whole point of Greek tragedy is that everything you do eventually comes back to you. You cannot run away from consequences. You can pretend you didn't do it. You can pretend it didn't happen. You can pretend it won't matter. But everything comes back to you. And to a certain extent, I think that what we are enacting on the national level is that the chickens are coming home to roost on virtually every level, politically, epidemiologically, the Black Lives Matter explosion, you know, all these things which we've repressed, pretended were over, pretended we dealt with, are blowing up. And that is, in a funny way, Paul, a very Greek phenomenon, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
You know, this is what tragedy is interested in. It's interested in the return of everything that you thought you could evade. And for that reason, I think, so to speak, we're in a very Greek moment, or it's one that the Greeks would have understood. I mean, I think at a national level, we've been acting like for so many years as if what we were doing would never have consequences in our political lives, in our attitude towards the environment, race, everything.
But guess what?
And now it's exploding all simultaneously, and that is sort of Sophoclean.
And in that way, a deep immersion in classical Greek literature, if it doesn't offer solace, it at least offers insight.
Well, right. Look, that's all we
can hope for.
Insight is better than solace, I would say.
Right.
Solace, I think we go for solace too often when what we want is insight. But I mean, this comes back, of course, to the point that we were discussing earlier, Paul, which is the humanities. You know, at the end of the day, that is what is going to help us to make sense of what is happening. All the more reason to embrace them rather than jettison them at this juncture, I would say. But then I have a dog in the race.
Daniel, what a pleasure it has been speaking with you. All too brief. There was so much more.
As always.
But better to be laissé sur sa faim. Better that we remain hungry with a sense of appetite for more. I really thank you, and I can't wait to hear your sonorous Odysseus. I really look forward to it, and thank you so much. And to all of our listeners, really, when Three Rings comes out, read it. It has the virtue both of incredible insight and, might I ask, of tremendous concision. So thank you so much. All the best to you.
Paul.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, all the best. Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support